But Obama administration has decided to bypass Congress on the issue of greenhouse gas. Can't pass cap and tax? Push the greenhouse agenda on the American people another way. So now, unelected bureaucrats in the EPA are trying to regulate greenhouse gases. Among the gases the EPA is trying to regulate is methane. According to EPA, 28% of the global methane emissions they classify as coming from human-related activities actually come from livestock. I don't think it's a coincidence that the EPA's move to regulate methane, including cow flatulence, comes on the heels of a report from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization that states livestock are one of the most significant contributors to today's most serious environmental problems. Urgent action is required to remedy the situation, unquote. Now, I'm pretty sure if you ask the ranchers of Florida's 5th District, as much as they'd like to regulate cows from passing gas, for plenty of reasons, some smellier than others, we just don't have that capacity.
Thank you. I know the gentleman from Florida mentioned the cow flatulence in our committee meeting last night, and it sounded like a topic that bore looking into. I did have the chance to look it up in the interim, and the Fox News had reported the prospect of EPA regulating cow and livestock gas. However, it never existed. Factcheck.org, which I looked it up on, dispelled the myth, and the EPA itself actually came out with a statement that said not only is there no such regulation that it discussed or was in the works, but even the EPA admitted it's not under their authority to regulate that in any way, shape, or form. So it is a false accusation with regard to the issue with regard to livestock. And, Madam Speaker, it's my...
They're going to blame it on cattle. They're going to tax cattle. They're going to tax the output because that's what they're proposing.
The bill before us, if the rule passes, does not change the Clean Air Act. It does not gut the Clean Air Act. It does not in any way prevent enforcement of the criteria pollutants that are regulated by the Clean Air Act. It simply says that greenhouse gases are not to be regulated under the Clean Air Act. Greenhouse gases, by definition, are necessary for life. As I stand here, Madam Speaker, and speak, I am creating, as I breathe in and out through the respiratory process, CO2. So under the dictates of today's EPA, I am a mobile source polluter because I am breathing. I am creating CO2. CO2, carbon dioxide, is necessary for life. Greenhouse gases are necessary to protect the environment. They have the ability to prevent heat from escaping into outer space, and that is what creates the temperature zone that allows life to exist. The radical environmentalists who think CO2 is a pollutant have decided amongst themselves, I don't know how they've done it, but they decided that the magic number for CO2 in the atmosphere should be about 350 parts per billion.
We finally have a number to crisply express our peril. Before the Industrial Revolution, the atmospheric concentration of carbon in the atmosphere was 275 parts per million, plus or minus 10 parts per million for all the 10,000 years of the Holocene. So depending on your predilection, that's the Genesis number, the Buddha number, the Shakespeare number, that's the world from which we came. Okay? On comes the Industrial Revolution. We begin to burn coal and gas and oil. That number begins to mount, but we never know just where the red line is, and given human nature, we always hope that it's a little further out in the distance so we can get to this problem and deal with it, or really rather so that our children can get to this problem and deal with it and we won't have to. But when the Arctic melts, that tells you that you may have crossed this line already. And in fact, after that sequence of events, many of our best scientists went back to work. An American team led by James Hansen at NASA and his colleagues, really our foremost climatologists, published a paper in January of 2008 that gave us a number. And that number, and it's the most important number on the planet, though we never knew it till 18 months ago, was 350 parts per million CO2. Any number greater than that, they said in the abstract of a peer-reviewed scientific paper, was not compatible with the planet upon which civilization developed or to which life on Earth is adapted. Strong language and a very strong number, especially strong when you consider that we're already past it. We're at 387 parts per million, and we are rising. We are not like the guy who went to the doctor, and the doctor said, you know, keep eating cheese at each meal, and sooner or later your cholesterol will be too high. We're like the guy who went to the doctor, and the doctor said, look, your cholesterol is way too high, and you're going to have a heart attack.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We spend a lot of time these days talking about costs. Cost of regulation, cost of repeal, cost of implementation. Conveniently missing from this discussion are the human costs, lives lost, those altered by heart attacks, asthma, and brain damage due to fine particulate matter in our air and mercury in our water. My hometown of Chicago knows this all too well. Chicago ranks second among all cities in the country adversely affected by power plant pollution. Two particularly egregious emitters, the Fisk and Crawford power plants, emit fine particulate matter that directly contribute to 41 deaths, 550 ER visits, and 2,800 asthma attacks annually. EPA estimates that fine particulate pollution from power plants shorten the lives of 1,356 people from my home state each year. Talk about cost.
Professor Van Allen told me about observations of Venus, that there was intense microwave radiation. Did it mean that Venus had an ionosphere, or was Venus extremely hot? The right answer, confirmed by the Soviet Venera spacecraft, was that Venus was very hot, 900 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was kept hot by a thick carbon dioxide atmosphere. I was fortunate to join NASA and successfully propose an experiment to fly to Venus. Our instrument took this image of the veil of Venus, which turned out to be a smog of sulfuric acid. But while our instrument was being built, I became involved in calculations of the greenhouse effect here on Earth, because we realized that our atmospheric composition was changing. Eventually, I resigned as principal investigator on our Venus experiment because a planet changing before our eyes is more interesting and important. Its changes will affect all humanity. The greenhouse effect had been well understood for more than a century. British physicist John Tyndall in the 1850s made laboratory measurements of the infrared radiation, which is heat. And he showed that gases such as CO2 absorb heat, thus acting like a blanket, warming Earth's surface. I worked with other scientists to analyze Earth climate observations. In 1981, we published an article in Science magazine concluding that observed warming of 0.4 degrees Celsius in the prior century was consistent with the greenhouse effect of increasing CO2. That Earth would likely warm in the 1980s, and warming would exceed the noise level of random weather by the end of the century. We also said that the 21st century would see shifting climate zones, creation of drought-prone regions in North America and Asia, erosion of ice sheets, rising sea levels, and opening of the fabled Northwest Passage. All of these impacts have since either happened or are now well underway. That paper was reported on the front page of the New York Times and led to me testifying to Congress in the 1980s. Testimony in which I emphasized that global warming increases both extremes of the Earth's water cycle. Heat waves and droughts, on one hand, directly from the warming, but also because a warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor with its latent energy, rainfall will become in more extreme events. There will be stronger storms and greater flooding. Global warming hoopla became time-consuming and distracted me from doing science, partly because I had complained that the White House altered my testimony. So I decided to go back to strictly doing science and leave the communication to others. By 15 years later, evidence of global warming was much stronger. Most of the things mentioned in our 1981 paper were facts. I had the privilege to speak twice to the President's Climate Task Force, but energy policies continued to focus on finding more fossil fuels. By then, we had 2 grandchildren, Sophie and Connor. I decided that I did not want them in the future to say, Opa understood what was happening, but he didn't make it clear. So I decided to give a public talk criticizing the lack of an appropriate energy policy. I gave the talk at the University of Iowa in 2004 and at the 2005 meeting of the American Geophysical Union. This led to calls from the White House to NASA headquarters, and I was told that I could not give any talks or speak with the media without prior explicit approval by NASA headquarters. After I informed the New York Times about these restrictions, NASA was forced to end the censorship. But there were consequences. I had been using the first line of the NASA mission statement to understand and protect the home planet to justify my talks. Soon the first line of the mission statement was deleted, never to appear again. Over the next few years, I was drawn more and more into trying to communicate the urgency of a change in energy policies, while still researching the physics of climate change. Let me describe the most important conclusion from the physics. First, from Earth's energy balance, and second, from Earth's climate history. Adding CO2 to the air is like throwing another blanket on the bed. It reduces Earth's heat radiation to space, so there's a temporary energy imbalance. More energy is coming in than going out, until Earth warms up enough to again radiate to space as much energy as it absorbs from the sun. So the key quantity is Earth's energy imbalance. Is there more energy coming in than going out? If so, more warming is in the pipeline. It will occur without adding any more greenhouse gases. Now, finally, we can measure Earth's energy imbalance precisely by measuring the heat content in Earth's heat reservoirs. The biggest reservoir, the ocean, was the least well measured until more than 3,000 Argo floats were distributed around the world's ocean. These floats reveal that the upper half of the ocean is gaining heat at a substantial rate. The deep ocean is also gaining heat at a smaller rate, and energy is going into the net melting of ice all around the planet, and the land, to depths of tens of meters, is also warming. The total energy imbalance now is about 0.6 of a watt per square meter. That may not sound like much, but when added up over the whole world, it's enormous. It's about 20 times greater than the rate of energy use by all of humanity. It's equivalent to exploding 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs per day, 365 days per year. That's how much extra energy Earth is gaining each day. This imbalance, if we want to stabilize climate, means that we must reduce CO2 from 391 ppm parts per million back to 350 ppm. That is the change needed to restore energy balance and prevent further warming. Climate change deniers argue that the sun is the main cause of climate change, but the measured energy imbalance occurred during the deepest solar minimum in the record, when the sun's energy reaching Earth was least. Yet there was more energy coming in than going out. This shows that the effect of the sun's variations on climate is overwhelmed by the increasing greenhouse gases, mainly from burning fossil fuels. Now consider Earth's climate history. These curves for global temperature, atmospheric CO2, and sea level were derived from ocean cores and Antarctic ice cores, from ocean sediments and snowflakes that piled up year after year over 800,000 years, forming a 2-mile thick ice sheet. As you see, there is a high correlation between temperature, CO2, and sea level. Careful examination shows that the temperature changes slightly lead the CO2 changes by a few centuries. Climate change deniers like to use this fact to confuse and trick the public by saying, look, the temperature causes CO2 to change, not vice versa. But that lag is exactly what is expected. Precise measurements by GRACE, the gravity satellite, reveal that both Greenland and Antarctica are now losing mass, several hundred cubic kilometers per year, and the rate has accelerated since the measurements began 9 years ago. Methane is also beginning to escape from the permafrost. What sea level rise can we look forward to? The last time CO2 was 390 ppm, today's value, sea level was higher by at least 15 meters, 50 feet. Where you're sitting now would be underwater. Most estimates are that this century we will get at least 1 meter. I think it will be more if we keep burning fossil fuels, perhaps even 5 meters, which is 18 feet. This century or shortly thereafter. The important point is that we will have started a process that is out of humanity's control. Ice sheets would continue to disintegrate for centuries. There would be no stable shoreline. The economic consequences are almost unthinkable. Now, the tragedy about climate change is that we can solve it with the simple, honest approach of a gradually rising carbon fee collected from fossil fuel companies and distributed 100% electronically every month to all legal residents on a per capita basis, with the government not keeping one dime. Most people would get more in the monthly dividend than they pay in increased prices. This fee and dividend would stimulate the economy and innovations, creating millions of jobs. It is the principal requirement for moving us rapidly to a clean energy future. Several top economists are co-authors on this proposition. Jim DePeso of Republicans for Environmental Protection describes it thusly: transparent, market-based, does not enlarge government, leaves energy decisions to individual choices, sounds like a conservative climate plan. But instead of placing a rising fee on carbon emissions to make fossil fuels pay their true cost to society, our governments are forcing the public to subsidize fossil fuels by $400 to $500 billion per year worldwide.
Yesterday, our Republican friends unveiled their budget proposal. That budget takes extreme right-wing trickle-down economics to new levels. They want to destroy Medicare as we know it and impose a huge tax increase on middle-class seniors through higher health care costs. They want to eviscerate Medicaid by turning it into a block grant program. They want to cut food stamps, education, infrastructure, environmental protection, and medical research, programs which actually create jobs and improve the lives of American working families. And at the same time, my Republican friends want to provide massive tax cuts to the very wealthiest Americans and corporations, including big oil companies that are reaping billions and billions and billions of dollars in profits each year. The Republican Party wants to increase health care costs for seniors in order to pay for their tax breaks for the rich. Those are wrong priorities, Madam Speaker.
Our colleagues on our side of the aisle have made it abundantly clear that this bill does not affect the Clean Air Act. What it does is help us rein in unelected bureaucrats who are arrogant and who believe that they have all the answers to what needs to be done in this country. And after listening to the debate over this issue, it's clear to me that nary a liberal here has read a book entitled Heaven and Earth by Ian Plimer, a renowned Australian geologist who takes a science-based approach to disproving so many of the myths underlying the man-made global warming theories. It's a unique, gripping, powerful book that would undoubtedly leave a deep impression on any independent thinker. I also want to mention, Madam Speaker, another book, a Heartland Institute book review of a book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Global Warming and Environmentalism by Christopher Horner, which highlights some of the motivations for liberals to persist with the man-made global warming theory. And I quote here, Horner tells us, global warming hysteria is truly the environmentalist dream come true. It's the perfect storm of demons and perils and the ideal scare campaign for those who would establish global governance. And he goes on, we're daily told of an alleged consensus on the issue, a concept actually foreign to science. And global warming alarmists want to put disbelievers on trial. They want to control our lifestyles without anyone being allowed to question their cause. And he says, nowhere is Horner more brilliant than in convincing the reader of the odious concept of consensus taking root regarding climate science, where alarmists and the rest of the global warming industry assail scientists and other experts with ad hominem campaigns to discredit them. History's full of efforts to stifle innovation by reference to unchallengeable authority of consensus. Galileo and Copernicus come quickly to mind. Madam Speaker, this shows the arrogance of our colleagues across the aisle and the arrogance of the bureaucrats. They think that we, human beings, have more impact on the climate and the world than God does. And we don't.
The gentlelady mentioned science, and one of the expert witnesses the Republicans called for last week's congressional hearing on climate science was Professor Richard Mueller of Berkeley. Now, this is a physicist who had gotten into the climate skeptic game, and I have to say the climate skeptic game is a very lucrative one for people. Anybody who finds a way to deny climate change sells lots of books, gets booked on the conservative talk show circuit, and does very well for themselves. And yet, despite the intensive economic pressure for climate scientists to deny climate change, 99% have stayed true to the scientific method, and the conclusion of the vast majority is that climate change exists. Now, Professor Mueller reported that his group's preliminary findings were that the global warming trend is very similar to that reported by prior groups. Now, this took some courage because of his belief in science. No doubt it hurts his own earning potential. I think he had been doing very well as a climate skeptic. Now he is somebody who has put his scientific principles above his own economic need. What science tells us is not always convenient. Every climate scientist that I know wishes that they could say that there was no danger from climate change, wishes there was no danger from carbon emissions. Nobody wants to be a harbinger of disaster. What a terrible thing to be, and yet they value the integrity of the scientific process.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Congressman Webster and I were walking past the rear of the chamber, and we looked at each other kind of funny after former comments and thought we were walking by a set for Comedy Hour. I mean, I think I really heard somebody allude to the fact that we need more government regulation, and for sure we need more taxes on the oil companies. Those evil oil companies, the answer to all our problems is to tax them more. As if the members of this body and the public is stupid enough to think that at the end of the year, those big oil companies are just going to write a check for an extra $1 zillion. Let's say we tax those evil oil companies another $1 a gallon. They're not going to write the check. We know what's going to happen. They're going to raise the price $1 a gallon. Or, given the corporate greed we sometimes see, round it off to $2 a gallon. Corporations don't pay taxes. Corporations collect taxes. They collect taxes from consumers who ultimately pay the tax. You add a tax to a product, and the consumer's going to pay more.
Let's give Jim an additional minute.
Now, the tragedy about climate change is that we can solve it with the simple, honest approach of a gradually rising carbon fee collected from fossil fuel companies and distributed 100% electronically every month to all legal residents on a per capita basis, with the government not keeping one dime. Most people would get more in the monthly dividend than they pay in increased prices.